very pleased to introduce our guest today, Ankit Mahadevia. He's a biotech CEO, entrepreneur, and author. He's co founded and led 9 biotech companies, collectively raising over $1 billion in capital and earning national recognition for workplace culture and leadership. He's also the author of Quiet Leader, Loud Results, and a speaker and lecturer on leadership, entrepreneurship, and business development, among many other things. Ankit, we're so happy that you could be here. Take it away.
Thank you, Max, and thanks to Northwestern for the chance to talk about this important topic. And I'm sure a lot of you, since you joined the webinar, have sort of contended with the same dilemma that I've contended with, which is how do you be yourself while still having the impact you want when not everyone looks or talks like you? And so I'll take you through a couple of things. One is my journey to where I am in my career and my journey to figuring out what it means to be an introvert as a leader. And we'll talk more about what introverts bring to the table and how to navigate some of the strengths and weaknesses that we all have. And then finally, and the most fun part will be really getting into some of your questions and some of the situations you're dealing with in your work and personal lives day to day. So, a little about me for some context. Based here in the Boston area, a town just outside of Boston, a town called Brookline. 2 boys. I'm a physician and an MBA by training. I was class of '01, and as you can see from my dual major at Northwestern, still was taking some time to figure out what I wanted to do with my life and still have finally figured it out. And so I began a period of time during and after college where I basically tried everything. I was in health policy with the US government and then on Ted Kennedy's staff at the Help Committee during medical school. And then I was in consulting at a few places as well. And then ultimately, it was a choice between growing within consulting and becoming a physician. I was actually within the 7-year med program at Northwestern. And so early in my life, I thought I wanted to be a physician, but then wanted to explore. And it was one of those moments where I felt like I'd regret it for the rest of my life if I didn't become a physician. And so I did. And I went to Johns Hopkins to study medicine. And I enjoyed my work. I enjoyed working with patients, but really I fell in love with building new companies when a professor of mine at Hopkins wanted my help because I had had prior business experience taking a new cream he'd developed for patients with nerve-based pain. And that was my first experience raising money and putting a drug into human trials with the team's help. And I put that back in the back of my mind because my med school said, look, you can't keep trying other projects. You should become a doctor. And I thought that's what I'd do. But then I got a call from a venture firm in Boston and thought I'd be there for 6 months before continuing my residency and ended up being almost 20 years ago. And so then I took the leap into venture capital and ultimately realized that building the companies that VCs fund was exciting to me. Founded 9 at all. And then after running one of the companies that ultimately went public, I've come back and now I'm a board member, an advisor, and CEO for multiple companies, including at a VC firm called Curie Bio. And during the depths of the pandemic, I started a book writing project about what it was to be an introvert, which is Quiet Leader, which we'll talk about today. So, and a lot of you, I'm sure, can relate. What was my experience as an introvert? And I contended with it in 2 ways. One was growing up. I'm South Asian by heritage, and in South Asian culture, a lot of the tendencies of extroversion, agreeableness, sociability, staying at long and loud parties is just part of the culture. And in a lot of ways, you kind of had to fake it as an introvert to really fit in or have people cast aspersions about you. And it's something that I had to deal with throughout just growing up. Um, also, early on in my career, even in medical school, we had to contend with it as well. I remember that I thought a lot about the emergency room when I was thinking about becoming a physician. And I remember in the middle of my emergency room rotation, my physician that was in charge of me took me aside and said, "Look, you could be a great ER doc, but you really got to speak up more. Maybe a few cups of coffee would do you well." And it was sort of like, okay, you don't really understand what introversion is. Coffee's not really the answer to this. I just don't think I'm in the right specialty. And so a lot of what I contended with, and I hear this a lot when we have these kinds of discussions, is about imposter syndrome. So, as an introvert, I felt like I really didn't belong in positions of real importance, whether that was leadership or otherwise. And trying to fake the ideal was ultimately exhausting and ineffective. It kind of hit home for me because over time I figured out that sort of seeing patients one at a time was gratifying, but not the kind of impact I wanted to have. And I felt like being a leader of a larger organization might be for me. So I ended up going to the Wharton School for Business School, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And so I took a class that literally was titled Leadership 101. And one of the courses, which I was excited about, was how to get your team excited around a cause. And, no, just sort of sit down, put down your books, and then the instructor plays this video, which which is not playing. But the basic ethos of it, it's Steve Ballmer, if you know this video, and he's getting his software developers excited for the cause. You can see that he's sweaty all over the place, and he's basically running down and up and down the stage, ranting to his developers at the top of his lungs. And this is my professor's example of what a motivating leader would be. And I turned to my classmate next to me. I said, "There's just no way in hell I'm going to be a leader, I guess, because that's not me. I couldn't do that with all the cups of coffee in the world." So why did I write Quiet Leader? During the pandemic, when a lot of folks were really missing, as was I, a lot of the human contact that we're used to, I found that I was actually pretty productive, and the alone time was kind of energizing. And so, in conversations with some of my introvert friends, we kind of figured out that look, we probably approach this thing differently. And it started me to sort of jotting down some notes, and ultimately, in collaboration with 30 other introvert leaders, we wrote Quiet Leader because I think the fundamental thesis is really important that the key to leadership is not being someone different than other than you are, but it's using who you are to its best effect. And what matters is not how you do it, but the fact that you are doing it.
Developers,
Well,
developers,
now it
developers.
started. Um, so let's shift gears then. What we're going to discuss is the premise of the book, which is um, what are the strengths that introverts bring to the work world and to personal lives and or nonprofits? The second is what are the challenges that they have to overcome? Some are pretty obvious and some aren't as intuitive. And the third is most of the time, even though it turns out the majority of us are introverts, we will work on teams with introverts and extroverts. And how do you balance those key differences? Because it turns out, I mean, as a board member and a CEO, and a coach to some teams, you find out that a lot of the interpersonal conflicts that you hear about in the team setting have to do with this difference in personality. So, first off, and it's actually not that commonly understood, what is an introvert? The science around introversion is pretty new. The first written definition of introversion was by Jung in the 20th century. So that concept is pretty new. And in the data that exists on who introverts are, and I'm a scientist by training, so I like data, the more than half of individuals are introverts. So most of us actually are introverts, even though you probably hear more from the extroverts. And at least a quarter of leaders identify as introverts. And in my informal poll, that's probably underreported because many leaders feel like it's not really a credential to identify as an introvert. And it's not just a preference, it actually correlates down to differences in brain function. And so they actually took MRIs of introverts and extroverts, and different parts of the brain light up for the same stimulus. One of the important takeaways is that for a given social stimulus, introverts' brains actually light up more. So the reason that they tend to shy away from loud parties and lots of interaction is because they just get stimulated more by the given by a given situation. So what does that all mean once you take all these wiring differences into account? It means that for introverts, interpersonal interaction takes energy instead of creating energy. And energy is directed inward rather than outward. So the way I think about it in teams, the fundamental difference is people who think before they talk and versus people who talk to think. And a lot of ideas that are generated internally and then exported to the world rather than those that are created through conversation and duration. And introverts tend towards focus deeper interaction, so fewer deeper relationships. The classic example was my co-founder at one of the companies I've been involved with, Sparrow Therapeutics. Tom is a brilliant microbiologist, and we were developing a new company to create new medicines to treat infection. Tom is thoughtful, insightful, funny. He's a great leader of people, and he's an extreme introvert. And I remember a story where we were fundraising, and for those that have been out raising funds, usually that's 50 meetings over the course of a few months, sometimes many in a day. And we went to New York and we were having these different meetings, one after another, back to back. And I'm giving my pitch, and then I usually look over to him and expect him to give his portion of the pitch. And, we'd gone from 9 to around 2:30. And at 3, I look over and he just walks up and leaves. And then I go, okay, what the hell is happening? So I pick up his slides and I just sort of do it and I try to play it off. Oh yeah, Tom has another meeting. And I look at the text, I'm like, dude, what the heck? And he said, too many people had to go. So that's Tom. He knows his limits and that was just too many people for him. So Tom brings a guy like Tom brings a lot of strengths, and it's important to note those because classically people think of introverts as not A1 first choice leaders. But a lot of the business leaders that we know, Mark Zuckerberg, Satya Nadella, Warren Buffett, they're all introverts. And what are the strengths that folks bring? The first is, well, and there was even a project called the CEO Genome Project, where they actually answered this question, where they followed noted introverts and extroverts over time and interviewed their boards. And it turns out that introverts actually met their board's objectives better than extroverted counterparts do. And there was another study by Adam Grant who's done some work on this, where they showed that although people were more likely to pick extroverts first as their prototype of a leader, people stayed longer and were more productive for introverted leaders. And why is that? One is introverts, just because they think to talk, tend to be, not always, but tend to be better listeners. Secondly, is that they have just innately the capacity for deep internal reflection. It can be both strength and weakness. And the other thing about being sort of more inwardly focused is when things are in a crisis, you appear at least, and I know sometimes I appear steadfast even if I'm not, but that's particularly helpful when you're trying to kind of take the disorder and the panic out of a room. And the other thing when you're sort of in your head as an introvert is you have the capacity for creative, deep thought. And there's just a long history of introverts that have created really amazing things. Da Vinci is an example. So, for every strength, though, there is some weakness. And one of them, and I relate, and maybe those introverts on the video also can relate, it's the limit that you have for the capacity of frequent human interaction. And I was just at a medical conference in Orlando. And generally, the weekend is my time to have some quiet time and recharge after a week long of Zoom and in-person meetings. But here I had to get right back to it, days of meetings with physicians and pharma companies and sort of fellow colleagues Saturday and then dinner and then Sunday and then dinner. And, you just get completely worn out. So my colleague Chris, who is one of the contributors to the book, um, you know, it was a big source of concern for him because one of his investors has what I kind of call the biotech Hunger Games, where you send all of your CEOs of your biotech companies to meet together along with pharmaceutical companies you may partner with. And they sort of put them in the room with the cocktail parties and presentations, and they kind of step back and see who does what and who engages. And you think that it's totally non-evaluative, but all of these folks jump in and evaluate the different CEOs and how well they presented and how well they worked the room. And Chris, as a total introvert, was terrified of this because he just knew he didn't have the capacity to do all of the cocktail parties and everything that his extroverted colleagues do, but he was still going to be held to the same standard. He as an introvert has a lower threshold for social interaction. The other thing that people often worry about, and I'm sure we'll talk about in the Q&A, is a volume and a speed bias. When you are more inwardly focused and you think to talk, people can also sometimes assume that your lack of words and your speed to thought means you don't know what you're doing or that your opinion doesn't matter. The other thing that happens is that Oftentimes, extroverts are chosen as leaders because of those perceptions, and they often pick people who are like them. Sometimes for good reason, because extroverts who think to talk often like people around them who think to talk. And I think for introverts in particular, it magnifies imposter syndrome, where you feel like it's already hard enough to stand out and be good at what you do. But now being an introvert, it's just a liability you have to carry and you have to keep proving yourself. And there's often a temptation to try to be someone you're not. Um, and for me, there was a sort of an aha moment that I capture in the first chapter of the book where I had joined a venture capital firm and I had done a good job, I feel, I mean, you can ask my colleagues, of doing the analytical work to support the team as they made investments. This particular firm also builds new companies, which is something that I now know I really love to do. And after a certain amount of time, they gave me the opportunity to lead one of those companies as the firm evaluated the investment. So I partnered up with couple of senior scientists. And when you develop drugs, it's really hard. And in this case, it was extra hard because the idea for the drug came from one place and the money for the drug came from another place. And the professor that was developing the drug was pretty difficult to deal with, but so was the set of investors that we were dealing with. And so it was a challenge each step of the way. And I felt like in order to get the team riled up to be part of the challenge, I had to be like Steve Ballmer. So I tried my best to will myself to a really strong personality, be very directive, pound on the table, be the most important and loudest person in the room because I was in charge. I had to be. And then we hit a setback where some of the early animal experiments for the drug just didn't look like they would work. And sometimes people rally together and try to find a solution. This time, all the scientists decided to walk away. And I asked them, like, look, we're this close. Why'd you walk away? And there was a variety of kind of reasons on the surface, but I asked kind of, why did you really walk away? And the lead scientist gave me some feedback and said, we just didn't think that you were dealing with a full deck. You had your cards pretty close to the vest, and it was pretty clear that you were trying to be someone that you weren't. And that hit me pretty hard because I thought, holy crap, this is my first shot at leading a company that I wanted to lead. And I'm terrible at it and never working at this field again. And I have to find something new to do. Maybe I should go back to med school. And what I did was really reflect. And thankfully, the team over there really had my back and they gave me more shots to do this. And that began a period of time where you sort of do trial and error to figure out how do you be you and how do you make it work for yourself. And that's sort of some of the lessons that we put into the book. One thing I'll note is just as, and some of you may be from different parts of the world, may not have grown up here, may speak different languages as your first language, may have grown up in another part of the country than the one you currently live in. And there's a variety of ways that people feel like outsiders. And a lot of the introverts that we talk to for the book talk about being a double outsider. So imagine that you are a minority to begin with and you're an introvert. And it's sort of one more thing that people feel like they have to deal with. And a lot of things that people really want, I think, in need in order to become effective leaders is belonging. And um, I just wanted to acknowledge that, I think being a double outsider really makes it important to even more double down on being yourself, as counterintuitive as that might be. So, where do we go from here? So, we know that introverts exist. They're more than half of us. We know that we have a lot to offer in our careers as we try to build something bigger than ourselves or try to have an impact on the teams that we're on. And we know we have strengths. We're good listeners. We're very thoughtful. We know that we have things we have to overcome in terms of how do we get our points across and how do we connect with people while being ourselves. So the ethos of the book was kind of thinking back 30 really, really accomplished leaders. There's an introverted senator in there, there's introverted heads of consulting firms, there's introverted tech entrepreneurs, and introverted CEOs. What are some of the things that they had in common that allowed them to kind of overcome their strengths and be effective? And a lot more in the book, and certainly can go into any of this in great detail in the Q&A. But we came up with four things that people often do to make the most out of the strengths of being an introvert while also addressing some of the things that can hold you back sometimes. The first, and they're in order for a reason, is preparation. So a lot of the introverts I know appear spontaneous and lively and um, on point and sort of like just like their extrovert colleagues. They're often hyper prepared. I know a very well-known introvert biotech CEO who spends time on the first, really writes out literally the first minute of any talk he gives because he feels like it gives him enough momentum to not be overcome by some of the largeness of the moment. Preparation can help counteract your kind of the time that introverts take to talk, as well as volume bias, and focus your energy in the right places. The other one is over indexing on transparency. Sometimes when you feel like an outsider, it's very easy to try to hide the part of yourself that makes you think that you're not good enough. It's the mistake I made when I first led that first biotech company is I overcompensated rather than being open about the things that I was dealing with. And I found in contrast that the more I experimented with being transparent, the more it counters the perception of a quiet person as having something to hide. I mean, in fact, as an example, now I've interviewed hundreds of people for many different jobs as a board member and as a CEO. And I often will tell people right up front that, look, I am an introvert. Just because I don't seem excited or I seem serious or angry doesn't mean I don't like you. It's just how my face is. And my wife can't even tell sometimes whether I'm excited, mad, or angry. And when you say that, it kind of relaxes people and helps them sort of not make an assumption about you. The third part is collaboration. All of leadership is a team sport, even if you are a one person in a one person firm. And it's important to leverage the people around you to support you. If they know that you're dealing with something, they can help you. And as an example, it's kind of knowing your strengths and weaknesses and limitations. I know when I've had enough in terms of external meetings. And I was fortunate enough to work with a team that knew that about me, and you often divide and conquer. You collaborate, you let the and enabling people who are naturally really good at certain things allows you to not have to do it all because the primary thing that you have as an introvert is energy. And once that energy is gone, you're really not at your best. And so it's using a team in collaboration that can help. And the final thing we talk about in the book is systematic thinking. So some of the hard things about being introvert, like I don't want to go to that last cocktail party. I don't want to go meet these investors just because I don't feel like it. I'll send them an email or a really well crafted slide, and that should do it. Sometimes it just doesn't. And sometimes you have to get out there, even if you think you can avoid it through collaboration or some other way. And then it's sort of, it's like anything else. The study of willpower suggests that just like social energy, you only have so much. And rather than will yourself to do it, I'm just going to do it. It's building it into your daily system. What does that mean? So if you remember my colleague Tom, he kind of knew about himself that he's pretty bad at going out there and meeting people. So he put on his calendar that 3 or 4 times a year, he would just fly somewhere and go meet the 5 or 6 people in the field of infectious disease that he wanted to meet. And even if he didn't want to do it, he already booked the flight, he already put it on his calendar, and he's just going to go. And we gained so much as a company because of those meetings that he did. But if he hadn't been systematic, he never would have done it. And here, technology is your friend. You can use the calendar to prompt you to do things. You can use social media and Zoom calls and blog posts and videos to get your message out there systematically so you don't have to will yourself to do it one meeting at a time. And it's sort of thinking about the broader tools you have to be able to be effective when you think about it in terms of teams. So, I will maybe the most fun part of this is these are sort of general observations that we've had as we've thought about being introverts. The most interesting part of this is to start to apply it more to your daily experience. And maybe I'll just seed it. I've done a lot of these discussions at big corporations, at universities, for folks that are just coming out of university to folks who've been in the working world for decades. And it's sort of the same questions seem to come up. And the main one is, do I need to, and someone used this term, do I need to flex to get noticed and move up? When I said, what's flex mean? Flex sort of means, do I have to be louder than I am to get noticed and sort of quote, move up? And how do you get your point across when other people maybe think and talk faster and louder than you? That's one. And the second is for those that are leading teams, how do you leave space for both kinds of people? You need introverts and extroverts to be at your best as an organization. And they both process the world so differently, but you all have to be in the same team at the same time. And how do you do that? So maybe that's a good segue, Max, to the Q&A, and I'd be delighted to talk more about what you're dealing with on a regular basis as an introvert.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ankit. So again, everyone, please feel free to use either the Q&A box or the chat if you have any questions. I see one here. Um, Somebody asks, what lessons can extroverts learn from introverts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And as I mentioned, there's a chapter in the book about this too, about both extroverts and introverts are critical to an organization. If you have just one type or another, I don't think you are accessing the world in the right way. And I don't actually think per se that there's a learning. It's just sort of a different way of viewing the world. And I think what extroverts can maybe learn about working with introverts is that fundamental piece about introverts talk to think, where extroverts think to talk. And what I've noticed is that as a real introvert, I can be pretty unnerving to an extrovert because in the setting of a social discussion, I give off very little in terms of input. I don't say much. My face is kind of a mask. And it really freaks the extroverts around us out. And I guess a key learning is doesn't mean that we as introverts don't like you or we're mad at you. It's just how we access the world. That's one. And the second thing is both for extroverts that are leading teams and part of it is everyone has a different speed to idea. And introverts often will kind of fully bake an idea and then take it out of the oven. And extroverts, my wife is an extreme extrovert, and I've noticed this, will kind of work it out externally. And I think it's sort of leaving space for both processes. And if you are the team leader in charge, it's knowing that you can't call the question too quickly, and so I noticed this in my mixed extroverted and introverted teams is, I'm an introvert, so I think hard about things, but I also like to decide really quickly. So sometimes I would think that we had all had our ideas out there and you kind of distill the best parts of each one to come to a consensus. And I would do that and everyone would say, yes, we had a decision, let's go. And then I'd start getting chat questions from some people. And then some people ask, well, why are we doing this? I don't understand. And then 2 days later, we still haven't come to a decision. And what I realized is I didn't give it the extra 20 minutes maybe I needed for people to fully form their thoughts and put them on the table. So it's sort of having the patience, even though things are compressed and, time is precious, to let everybody kind of fully process and put their thoughts out there.
See someone in the Q&A. They ask, how do you deal in particular with the imposter syndrome element?
Yeah, it is and it this comes up so often. I think all of us deal with this, whether we're extroverts or introverts. And I think for introverts, it's even harder because you feel like there is something holding you back. One, and two, in a group setting, and I've been there, when you take your time and you think of your best idea, and one of two things happen. Either some extrovert jumps in and says what you were about to say, or the conversation moves on. You feel like you just didn't contribute anything. It's like the worst feeling in the world. I remember it was my first board meeting as a board member, and there's all these really experienced people, and I wanted to say the perfect thing. So I wrote it down and I waited for my moment, and I was about to say it, and then someone jumped in and said the same thing. And I was like, oh man, I have nothing useful to say. And so how do you deal with that? I think, and it was actually the hope of writing the book, which is I hope that as more leaders kind of quote out themselves as introverts, it kind of normalizes it, right? It's not a weakness, it's just a different way of looking at the world. That's one. And second, it's often helpful to rely on the strengths you do have. Um, and I've found that a lot of and as a CEO, everyone does 360 reviews, and I sort of think hard about what the data tell me on how effective I've been as a leader. And a lot of the strengths that folks note about me come from introversion, the calmness under pressure, the ability to really listen, the ability to synthesize deep thoughts and leave space for others. It's not like I'm some genius, just how I'm wired. When you say less, you leave space for others to say more. And it's celebrating those things while at the same time knowing that, like everybody else, extroverts too, there's things you're going to have to continue to grow in if you're going to grow as a leader.
A question here. Someone asks, how can I push myself to stop accepting the role of the worker bee in group projects, even though that's the most comfortable role for me?
Yeah. And this was my even now, right? I'm just much more comfortable writing something out rather than trying to get out in front of people and do things. There's definitely an inertia for an introvert when you're comfortable with numbers and data and deep thinking. And I think the pushing yourself, there's a few great chapters in the book about this, comes in a few ways. I think one is being clear on the impact you want to have. If you know the your end in mind, it can help. The second is, in the spirit of systematic thinking, it's letting it be known to folks around you where you want to head in your career. Sometimes, I did. I felt it was obvious that as a junior person, I want to grow, but it's actually not obvious to everyone what you want and why you want to do it. And, finding a mentor early on that can help can put you in a position to do that. And then the third, and I noticed this early in my career, is sort of the balance between asking for permission and then seeking forgiveness. And sometimes you just take that next step, right? And what's a great example? Early in my career, I was the guy in the senator's office that would, back in the day when you would, hand clip newspaper articles and put them together for the staff to read. I would do that. And it was very comfortable to do that because I could just sit in a dimly lit room and just do it. But I wanted to be part of the discussion. And so I took that one step forward where not only did I put the articles together, but I also stitched together what they mean. And I asked for the opportunity to go present them, as scary as it was. And it was useful to the team because no one had actually taken the time to think about what the articles actually mean, and it was useful. And sometimes people say yes, and sometimes people say no, but it's sort of taking that next committed step to get out there and then learning from it. Sometimes it'll go great but feel crappy, and it's good to carry. And sometimes it'll go crappy but feel great, and it's good to figure out why. And it's sort of learning from that and trying the next thing.
And a great question that just came in. I really like this one. Um, Someone says, you mentioned the importance for leaders to create space for both introverts and extroverts. Can you share some examples of how you do this, particularly as we work in hybrid environments?
Yeah, this is such a good question. And actually, kind of like the Super Bowl of doing this was in the heart of the pandemic, where everything was hybrid. And the technology is such that sometimes it lends itself to more extroversion because you have to take a little extra effort to get out there. So a couple of things that we list in the book about how to do this. One is starting, especially for teams that work together over a longer period of time, it's taking inventory of that. As you start to form as a team, it's acknowledging who you are as a leader. It's acknowledging what the personality types of everyone else is out there. And it's not sort of, well, I'm an introvert. Well, what does that mean? It's more, well, okay, the way I think, I often state this up front with people I work with. I think in writing, one, and two, I think before I talk. So you'll see me process before I take something out. And it's good to know where everyone's at because then you can sort of meet them where they are. That's one. The second is, as I was mentioning earlier, it's understanding that different people will take different times to both understand what you're sharing with them and have their own unique take. And it's making sure that you leave enough space in the course of a meeting that both the fast to idea people who talk to think to the slower to idea people who think really hard and then put their points out there. That's one. And the second is listening really carefully. And now we've all been in Zoom long enough that you can see even on the screen people's tells. And I knew this, like Tom, the guy that I was talking about, when he's on a Zoom call, and he really didn't agree with the direction we were going, he'd sort of turn his camera off, take a break, and then come back. And when I saw that, I said, okay, Tom doesn't agree. Let me draw him out because clearly he's not. And it's sort of getting to know your team that way. And the final thing I like to do, if you can help it, sometimes you can't, is try to send something for people to chew on ahead of time if you have a big decision to make, because that gives the people who think to talk a chance to prepare. And when you ask an introvert, man, how can I help you be as effective as possible? They say, oh God, if I could prepare, if I could read ahead of time, I'll be so ready. It's just really scary sometimes for an introvert to think on the fly because not only are you trying to form your thoughts, but it also takes energy to get it out there. The final thing is that technology is your friend, especially in bigger groups. We'd use things like polls and chats because sometimes people feel more comfortable getting their ideas out there that way.
Another question that I had sort of thought of for you is what do you say to someone who's an ambivert who sort of considers themselves in the middle? Um, is there an ideal balance? Is that just again sort of how you are? And like what skills do those people bring to the table?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, actually, after I read the book, my two sons sort of self-diagnosed themselves. They're both ambiverts as well. And, I think in some ways, right, introversion is a spectrum. Everyone is some type of ambivert. And when you say you're an introvert, you're kind of leaning towards one pole more than the other. And for ambiverts, often, like everybody, where your introversion and extroversion show up is often situational, right? So, a lot of ambiverts I know come up as introverts in the work world and they're complete extroverts in their family life and at home. That is absolutely my older son, who considers himself an ambivert, total extrovert outside of home, but very think to talk at school. And so, my younger one is maybe more the opposite. He presents very extroverted in his school life, but he's actually quite the introvert at home. And it's sort of knowing in which sphere you manifest what so that you can, manage that yourself. And I think, a true ambivert does have, in some ways, the best of both worlds. And I've seen them on teams actually kind of form sort of a glue function because they can sort of meet everybody where they are.
Another question that we have, were there any particular moments where your quiet leadership was particularly effective in contrast to what would be considered a louder style of management?
Yeah. One, and I sort of alluded to this, when things are uncertain and scary, I got that feedback, especially in the early months of the pandemic, where not only, as a company that develops infectious disease medicines, were we not sure how are we going to enroll trials? Was the economy going to fall apart? Were we going to be able to raise money? And even at home, can I get groceries? Am I going to be, what's the life expectancy? All of those things, it was just a scary, uncertain time, while at the same time we were reimagining how we work together virtually. And I think that, the affect you give off as an introvert, where you're sort of, taking it in a little more and maybe you're a little less reactive, at least visibly, although I was, I'm sure terrified many times, during that period of time, kind of helps people because as, like it or not, people take cues from leadership. And if your affect is, not that excitable, then in times where it doesn't pay to be excited or panic, it can be super helpful. And so I'd say that that sort of period, March, April, May 2020, was one in particular where I thought that it was extremely helpful. The other place where I think it's extremely helpful is when you have been fortunate enough to, find people around you on your teams that have really good ideas. And I think the less you talk, the more you leave space for people to bring their good ideas together. And I think in those two settings, it can be quite effective. And on the balance side, I will say with full humility that being an introvert doesn't help you when you're at the big investor conferences. It didn't help me when I was at this medical meeting because, after 5 hours of meetings, I was done. And I definitely didn't take as many meetings as I could have. And I bet an extrovert could do those three, four more meetings that I just was done with.
I'm going to let some folks have a couple more minutes here to put in questions, but one question that I sort of thought of as we were going through this presentation, what's your opinion on people who, let's say, you're extremely introverted or extremely extroverted? What's your opinion on people intentionally, changing course almost as a practice exercise? Like, obviously, you don't want to be doing you don't want to be someone that you're not all the time. Can it be helpful for someone who's very extroverted to practice more introverted things? Can it be helpful for an introvert to say, like, okay, I am going to put myself out here in this way? And how would you go about that?
Yeah, I think both are extremely important. And actually, it's a funny contrast between my wife and me. My wife's an extreme extrovert, so she's been practicing things like that to sort of see the introverted side, and I've been doing the opposite. I can take them both. I mean, in terms of introversion, yeah, leading authentically doesn't mean that you're not trying new hard things. I think it just means that you're taking your own spin on them. For example, this book talk is something that 10 years ago I would just say, no way. I already have enough human interaction. I'm good. But, this was, a really good exercise for me. And the way I do it differently is I actually know it about myself that I can't actually do these things unless I'm genuinely interested and excited in what I do. I can't fake it. And if I'm not interested, I don't do it. And I think that's the place that I lead from. The second place that I lead hard things from is think about the mission too. I've noticed that introverts will often go the extra mile to do the hard human interaction things when it's in service of a goal. When you tell them just go out there and give a few speeches, do a few meetings, no way, forget it. But it's more, well, can you go meet these folks because they might be able to help us with this particular idea and these particular resources. And then you're doing a job, you're doing something that's part of your overall goal. And I think that makes it a heck of a lot easier to get out there and try. So it's less about whether you try things that are more natural to extroverts. You should. It's more about how you go about it. And on the extroverted side, my wife experiments a lot with things that sort of help with listening, quiet mind. She does a lot of, for example, meditation is an interesting way that people think about, how do you, if you don't usually think to talk, how do you try to create time to process your ideas within sometimes? The other thing that she does, and actually both she and I have done this, she's part of an improv troupe, and part of the training at improv is the key to being a good improv player is listening. And you can't actually think to talk as an improv person. You really have to have the idea and jump into it. And so it sort of trains your brain, under the glare of lights in the audience to sort of think about yourself in a different way. And I think that she's found it's really helped her be, and not that she needed any help, but more that there were, sometimes it's hard to think to talk, and sometimes, it's hard to fill the space, and sometimes you have to be comfortable with silence. And I think both types of practices had helped her.
I appreciate a lot the meditation point. I know that they said that there's no such thing as a bad meditator, but I am a bad meditator. But I'm
Me,
getting there and practicing.
me too. I mean, it's hard to have a quiet mind for sure.
It's tricky. Um, so okay, we've got a couple questions that just came in. Um, have you experienced organizations slash groups that don't recognize the value of an introvert? And do you now see that as a red flag and avoid?
That's such a good question. Yeah, definitely. There are organizations that actually I've seen both, right? Is that there's organizations that seem to favor introverts and organizations that seem to favor extroverts. And I think both don't actually work because I cannot think of some, an endeavor that a team does together professionally that doesn't require both types of thinkers and doers. And I think you're just worse off as an organization if you do that. Um, and I guess the second order question of that question is, well, you found this great company, great role, you interview with everybody, and oh man, you're an introvert, and they're all extreme extroverts. Should you run screaming or should you try it out? And I think that the important part of it is to experiment with whether noting that you're an introvert and how you think about the world is going to be how do they respond to that? And I think people can be extroverts, but also very open and tolerant of different ways of approaching things. And I think that's the key, right? I mean, you would not, just to take an extreme, if you were, I'm a Chicagoan born and raised, I would not avoid joining a team full of people from California just because they're from California. I would not join them if they had some sort of problem with me being from Chicago. And I think about that the same way.
Someone wrote, I noticed my extroverted colleagues get promoted more often Any tips on how introverts can assert their value in a workplace that has bias for extroverts?
Yeah, it's a fundamental question, and organizations large and small, a lot of folks ask me the same question, and I think it's all of the things that we had mentioned in terms of getting noticed. Being it's being prepared. So, if you know you have an objective, you have to acknowledge to yourself, and I did, that introverts often have to prepare more or seemingly more to have the right impact. Know your audience, know what you want to accomplish, think ahead, read ahead. And sometimes that can take you out of your head when it's time to present. And knowing what gives you the confidence to speak. For me, it's being passionate about and knowing what I'm talking about. And if I feel both, I will speak up. And if I don't, I see myself kind of hanging back a little bit. It's also thinking systematically. You don't have to do this alone. And it's acknowledging that this is something you want to work on with your mentors and with the team around you. And then, there are absolutely ways that little by little you do the work. There's no substitute for trying to speak up. The other thing that to do is um, transparency. Sometimes, I thought, well, it's people passed over me or people didn't think I was worthy of this leadership group because I didn't speak up enough. And sometimes that's not true. It's actually that because you didn't speak up enough, they don't know you. And it's just making sure that you resist the temptation when you feel like an outsider of not being transparent about yourself and who you are. And that's often the first step to build trust and be considered for things. And I'm not going to say it's easy. It's really not, but there is a way to do it systematically to get there.
A nice compliment slash question here. Did you have any public speaking training? This person writes, your presentation is excellent. And they say, I make myself talk in work Zoom meetings, but I always feel I'm speaking too quickly or quietly, stumbling over words, etc.
Yeah, great question. I don't really have a lot. So here's my formal speaking training. I did one improv class with my then girlfriend, now wife, mostly to impress her. And then I did, after one of my more recent companies started to raise money from the public markets, I had one round of formal speaker training there. And then beyond that, it was just iteration, iteration, iteration. And so the short answer is no, not really, but I am a big proponent of that. My general philosophy and its ethos of the book is no mindset is fixed. The brain is amazing, and you can train yourself to do just about anything. I highly recommend improv. There are absolutely good public speaking courses that you can try. I think the key there, and it's one of the reasons why me personally I haven't done as much, is I find that some of that formal instruction risks me being a little less authentic, right? Like I just try to get into the didactics. It's like when I took dance lessons, it was pretty bad because I'm trying to remember all the steps one by one, and I'm not, and that's how I feel about public speaking. But I absolutely, in the cohort of folks that contribute to the book, several people have thought extremely highly of it.
Here's another question we got. Somebody says, I'm worried that because I have a reputation as an introvert, if I speak up or write an email, I'm just going to add that in myself, write an email, whatever, that it's going to be perceived as inauthentic. How can how can this person make space for themselves without seeming like they're pushing too hard?
Yeah, and it's a total absolutely. I mean, every time that I would sort of venture out to say something, my self-perception was I was yelling and I was hogging all the attention from everybody else. And, it turns out that people don't actually think about you all that much. And it's sort of turning off that sort of self-monologue. Chances are that you're probably perceiving the volume and frequency of what you're saying, logarithmically higher than everybody else. And it's sort of taking it one step at a time. One of the superpowers of an introvert is listening carefully. You'll know if people are not perceiving you authentically or not. The other thing that I'll say is sort of a positive is, and I noticed this about my introverted team members. Tom was a good example. he didn't say much, but when he said something, you darn well better listen because you knew it was important because his threshold to talk was, and so I think if you sort of follow that ethos, I think you'll be surprised how much people will take you seriously because it's often quality over quantity too.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So I'll leave folks just a few more moments here to pop any in the chat. But I wanted to say quick few reminders to everybody. This is our final webinar of 2025. So very happy that Ankit could be our final guest of the year. Again, we always appreciate any feedback that you might have. So please consider filling out the survey that we send after the event. We're going to send out information on Quiet Leader Loud results. I'm going to include that in our post-event email if people are interested in the book. And Ankit, do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with everybody?
Well, I really enjoyed the Q&A. It's such an interactive group. I really appreciate it. And thanks for the opportunity, Max and Northwestern, to talk about this. I guess the one thing that I'd leave you with is, introverts are powerful people on any team. And the key to using that power is being true to who you are and just accomplishing your mission in a different way that's unique to you. And I think that a lot of introverts are excellent leaders. For me as well, it's sort of just having permission from yourself to go out there and do it.
This was phenomenal advice. And as usual, I'm always very impressed not only by our alumni speakers, but by all of the registrants. This was a great chat. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for staying engaged with the Alumni Association throughout the year. We hope you've learned some valuable lessons, and that you can take some things into 2026 and make it even better. So, Ankit, thank you so much again. Thank you, everybody. Have a good holiday season and almost Happy New Year. Thank you all.